Night hangs over a vast city. The streets are narrow lines of silver, the rivers look like black glass, and the houses, thousands of them, sit close together like tinder. Then, faint at first, you hear it. A distant rolling thunder that does not fade. You look up, way up. At almost 6 miles high, where the air is thin and bitterly cold, a shape crosses the moon. It is not a handful of planes. It is a procession, a flying highway of machines too high for searchlights to pin and too fast for most fighters to catch. Doors open. Something falls. Many things fall. And the night begins to glow. Here is the question that drove fear into pilot-ready rooms across Japan in late 1944. Why couldn't the best interceptors, flown by battle-tested men, stop this new American bomber? Were the defenders too few, too late, or was the bomber itself so far ahead that traditional defenses were already obsolete? In this episode, we go back to the start, the machine itself, the global logistics that carried it to Asia, and the geography that suddenly made Japan reachable. We end where everything turns, when precision failed at altitude and a new, harsher playbook took over. The bomber was called the B-29 Superfortress, and it was exactly that. A flying fortress, made super by technology most air forces did not yet have. Its crew compartments were pressurized, a rare luxury in World War II. That meant pilots, bombardiers, and gunners could work at 30,000 feet without oxygen masks frosting their faces or cold draining their fingers. Inside, a narrow pressurized tunnel arched over the bomb bay, so crew could crawl between front and rear sections, while the aircraft cruised above weather that pinned other planes down. The engines were huge Wright R-3350s with turbo-superchargers that gulped thin air and still made power. The wings were long, the fuselage clean, the skin flush riveted for speed. On a good day, the Superfortress could carry 10 tons of bombs. On a long-range day, it could still lift a serious load farther than anything America had flown before. But the true magic sat in the gun system. Most bombers of the era had men standing in windy blisters behind hand-aimed guns. The B-29 did not. The wings were long, the fuselage clean, the skin flush riveted for speed. On a good day, the Superfortress could carry 10 tons of bombs. On a long-range day, it could still lift a serious load farther than anything America had flown before. But the true magic sat in the gun system. Most bombers of the era had men standing in windy blisters behind hand-aimed guns. The B-29 did not. Its turrets were remote-controlled, steered by periscopic sights linked to an analog brain, General Electric's central fire control system. Several gunners could call a turret, and the computer would add lead, drop, and parallax to the aim. In simple language, the bomber could protect itself with fewer people, less drag, and smarter fire, all while the pilots kept formation tight and the bombardier focused on the run. To Japanese pilots who had cut their teeth against B-17s and B-24s, this was something new, a heavy bomber that flew higher, faster, and shot back with uncanny accuracy. A machine that advanced is only the first ingredient. You also need a way to get it where it matters. In early 1944, America tried something audacious called Operation Matterhorn. The idea was simple on paper and brutal in reality. Base the new bombers in eastern India, fly fuel and bombs over the Himalayas to forward airfields around Chengdu in China, then strike targets in Japan. The route over the hump was long, dangerous, and weather-bound. Every gallon of fuel burned in China had been hauled by another airplane that burned fuel to carry it. Runways had to be lengthened by hand. Spare engines, ammunition, and even food crawled through a supply chain that stretched from American ports to Indian rail lines to mountain air ferries to Chinese truck convoys. For every combat sortie, many flights were pure hauling runs. Still, the signal mattered. On the night of June 15–16, 1944, B-29 staged through China and struck the Yawata steel complex on Kyushu. The physical damage was limited. First missions often are, but the raid proved a point no one in Tokyo could ignore. The home islands were no longer outside the bomber's reach. Japanese commanders had to start thinking about defense in their own backyard. American commanders, meanwhile, learned hard lessons about distance, weather, and the burnout cost of a supply line that had to fly itself. Everything changed when the Central Pacific Campaign delivered new ground, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Those islands are dots on the map, but for air planners they were a revelation, long, safe runways within direct range of Tokyo. The U.S. Navy had fought and bled to seize them in the summer of 1944. The U.S. Army Air Forces moved in like a factory setting up on fresh concrete. The IXI-1 Bomber Command formed, wings arrived, and the airfields grew into small cities, their taxiways as busy as highways, their hard stands crowded with B-29s in silver and olive drab. From the Marianas, crews did not need to stage through China or beg space on the hump. Fuel came by tanker, bombs by ship, and spare parts by the shipload. The air war became a production line. The first mission to Tokyo from these bases lifted on November 24, 1944. The target was the Nakajima engine plant at Musashino, one of the beating hearts of Japan's aircraft industry. The plan said this would be a daytime, high-altitude strike by massed formations, just like the precision doctrine used against Germany. What happened next forced a rethink. Over Japan, the bombers met something they had not trained for in the continental United States. The jet stream, a river of air that can scream along at over 200 miles per hour, right where the B-29 liked to fly. The winds tore at tight formations, blew bombs off aim points, and turned careful geometry into drifting scatter. Crews that prided themselves on precision watched bomb patterns slide away from factories and into open ground. Clouds closed in as winter built. The machine was right. The doctrine was wrong. For this theater, in this weather. The numbers told the same story. Large raids produced small results. Crews returned cold, fatigued, and frustrated. The B-29 could clearly reach Japan. It could even survive at those heights, trading its speed and shrewd gun system against the thin defenses that could climb that high. But reach was not effect. The jet stream did not care about theory. It cared about physics, wind, drag, drift, and time, while Japanese industry churned on beneath the clouds. In pilot debriefs and command post map rooms, you could feel the pressure build. The public at home expected the new bomber to deliver decisive blows. The Navy had paid dearly to capture the Marianas. Leaders needed results. Japanese pilots, for their part, felt both shock and strain. They found that even when they reached the bomber stream, the fight was brief and punishing. Tail gunners could hit them from far out. Top and belly turrets could be pointed by whichever gunner had the best view. Early interceptions, often made above 25,000 feet, ran into thin air that robbed engines of power and pilots of stamina. Climb rates that sounded good in a handbook looked different when fuel was scarce, oxygen gear iced up, and the target was still 1,000 meters above you, moving, shooting, and throwing off trails that flickered in the wind. Yes, some B-29s fell. One was even brought down by ramming on that first Marianas-based Tokyo mission. But this was not a defense that could be scaled night after night and month after month. So commanders in the Marianas faced a crossroads at the end of 1944. Keep trying the textbook method and accept low accuracy in exchange for safety, or change the rules, accept new risks, and get the results the strategy demanded. The man who made that choice and what he changed will define everything that follows in this series. But before we go there, we should appreciate what the first months proved. The Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was a system: airframe, guns, engines, crews, maintenance, shipping, fuel, and a chain of airfields pushing across the Pacific. It could reach Japan and survive, which alone would have reshaped the war. Yet in those early daylight raids, reach and survive was not enough. Think back to our opening image: a city under moonlight, a procession of aircraft too high and too fast to stop. In late 1944, that picture was only partly true. The shapes were there, the height was there, the shock certainly was there. But the glow that followed was not yet the firestorm the world would witness in 1945. That demanded a different idea about how to use the machine. Not as a high-altitude scalpel, but as a nighttime sledgehammer, lighter, lower, and loaded with a weapon suited to wood and paper neighborhoods. That demanded a theater-level decision to trade altitude for effect. And that brings us to the hinge of the story. If accuracy failed at altitude, what happens when the bombers come lower? At night. In Part 2, we follow the pivot that turned scattered daylight circles on a bomb plot map into entire districts burning in a single raid. The machine had arrived. The tactics were about to catch up. Night in Tokyo starts with a whisper, the wind flicking laundry lines, the Sumida River turning like black glass, a million wooden roofs holding their breath. Then the city hears a new kind of weather. It isn't rain, it's engines, hundreds of them, moving like a slow storm you can't see yet. People step outside and tilt their chins up. Somewhere far above the smoke of coal stoves and winter fires, the Americans are coming again. But this time, they are not where you expect them to be. They are lower, they are faster, and they are carrying fire. Here's our question tonight. When high-altitude precision failed over Japan, why did a sudden shift to low-altitude night raids change everything? Tactically, morally, and militarily? And if the B-29s came down to meet the city, what could Japan's best pilots and gunners really do to stop them? The new plan was simple and ruthless. Major General Curtis LeMay took over WW2 Bomber Command in January 1945 and rewrote the rules. No more betting on clear skies and tight formations fighting jet stream winds. Crews would go at night, down in dense air, loaded with incendiaries instead of mostly high explosives. Many B-29s left most of their guns and gunners on the ground to save weight. Lighter aircraft could carry more firebombs and needed less fuel. At these altitudes, accuracy jumped, airframes ran cooler, and the stream moved quickly through the target. It was a calculated risk, and it would remake the war over Japan. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, the test of that idea came over Tokyo. The target was the crowded working-class districts east of the Imperial Palace, neighborhoods built of wood and paper, laced with narrow canals and lanes. The first waves drew a flaming X across the city to mark the aim point. Then the bomber stream followed that light like a road. In a few hours, roughly 16 square miles were erased, and an estimated 100,000 people were dead, the single deadliest air raid of the war. For the men in those bombers, the shock was the color of the sky beneath them, orange, then white. For the men on the ground, it was the heat, the wind that twisted fire into ropes, the sound of whole blocks collapsing. Why did it burn so completely? Because the bombs were designed for these houses and these streets. Clusters of M69 incendiaries punched through thin roofs, delayed for seconds, then spit jets of flaming napalm into attics and rooms. Once scattered fires linked up, the city's civil defense could not cope. Water mains failed. Fire engines stalled in smoke and heat. Wind made everything worse. In less than 3 hours, the glow could be seen for 100 miles. From the cockpit of a B-29, the danger no longer came from the thin, freezing air at 30,000 feet. It came from below, searchlights, flak, and a few fighters clawing into the dark. But Japan's home defense system was exhausted. Ammunition was short. Fire units were told to hold their rounds unless they were sure of a hit. Heavy guns that could reach high-altitude bombers were less effective when the Americans came in low and spread out. Even around Tokyo, the most defended city, flak thinned as gun crews choked on smoke and fires climbed their positions. The math had turned. More bombs, closer to the ground, at night. Fewer chances for defenders to land a killing blow. What about the pilots? Japan threw every interceptor it had at the problem. The Army's Kai-44 Shoki and Kai-84 Hayate, and the Navy's new bomber killers, the J-2M Raiden and the N-1K2J Shidenkai, were all capable machines on paper. In practice, the story was crueler. Engines were unreliable, oxygen systems froze, fuel was short, training pipelines were thin. Against daylight B-29s, just reaching the stream in time for an attack could eat most of a sortie. At night and at lower altitude, the window to find and hold a target got even smaller. The Shidenkai was a superb dogfighter, and elite units like the 343rd Kokutai fought hard in 1945, but their moment rarely lined up with the bomber streams. The Raiden climbed well, but suffered from engine issues and limited numbers. The result was often a single firing pass, if that, before darkness and speed swallowed the fight. Japan turned to night fighters to meet night fire. The twin-engine Kai-45 Toryu and J1N1 Gecko carried heavy cannon, sometimes mounted obliquely to fire upward from below, copying a tactic that had worked for German night fighters. A handful carried simple airborne radar sets. In theory, these were the tools you needed for a dark sky. In practice, sets were scarce, training was rushed, and ground control was fragmented. Many crews got one try through the column of bombers and were gone, overtaken by speed, blinded by smoke, or simply unable to relocate the stream after their first pass. Desperation breeds dangerous ideas. In late 1944 and early 1945, several home defense units formed ramming flights, Shinten Sikutai, stripping aircraft and ordering pilots to hit B-29s with their own machines if guns or weather failed. Some pilots volunteered, others followed orders into a world where one attack could mean a parachute into black water or fire. Ramming did down some superfortresses, but it was not something a nation could scale night after night. It was a sign that the defense had run out of time. By spring, the Americans widened the fire. After Tokyo, the same method hit Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. The campaign wasn't just about factories, because factories were inside neighborhoods, tiny workshops under eaves and behind houses. That was the hard truth of Japan's urban industry, and LeMay's plan aimed directly at it. U.S. Air Force summaries from the period described the results in blunt terms. The industrial capability of the biggest cities was wrecked in weeks. For the defenders, each new night meant too many fires, too few hoses, too little ammunition, and a sky full of engines. If you were a Japanese pilot in March 1945, the mental picture of a B-29 had changed. It was no longer a silver dot far above your ceiling. It was now a darker shape passing over smokestacks and canals, with fewer gun flashes along its flanks, moving fast in turbulent air that shook your sights. You could hit one. Some did. But you could not stop hundreds. And when the glow on the horizon began, it felt less like a battle and more like a natural disaster with a flight plan. This is how a doctrine becomes a city's weather. LeMay switched to low altitude. Night incendiaries took the strengths of the Superfortress, range, radar navigation, endurance, and matched them to Japan's weakness, flammable cities and thin, overstretched defenses. The shock was not only technical, it was moral. Flyers spoke of the smell that seeped into cockpits. Firemen told survey teams after the war that there were nights when water did nothing and wind did the killing. The strategy broke production, shattered transport, and scarred a generation. Night over the Pacific is a long black mirror. Somewhere on that water, a crippled bomber limps home, fuel needles trembling, engines coughing, crew silent. Ahead, a small volcanic tooth rises from the sea. A strip of light appears. Wheels come down. The island catches the bomber like a catcher's mitt. Here is our question tonight, the last step in this story. Once America seized Iwo Jima and rewired its B-29 tactics, why did Japan's air defenses collapse so quickly, and how did mining the sea choke what the flames could not? By the end, we'll also answer the larger thing we've been circling for 2 parts. What, precisely, made the B-29 raids so hard to stop? The Americans called it VLR, Very Long Range, Fighter Escort. The idea sounded absurd 2 years earlier. Take land-based P-51 Mustangs off a rock in the Bonins and meet bombers over Honshu. But on April 7, 1945, 119 Mustangs from 7th Fighter Command lifted from Iwo Jima, climbed into the cold, and met more than 100 Superfortresses over Tokyo for the first land-based fighter escort to the Japanese mainland. The target was Nakajima's engine works. The message was bigger. From now on, the bomber stream would not be alone. Iwo was more than a jumping-off point. It was a net stretched under every mission. In the months that followed, more than 2,000 B-29s used its runways as an emergency field. Contemporary Air Force and museum accounts place the figure around 2,200–2,450 landings, with debate after the war about how many were life-saving emergencies versus routine. Diversions. Even historians who argue the saves are overstated concede that the island materially aided the campaign, giving damaged, fuel-starved crews a place to live instead of a place to die. With escorts above and a safe runway ahead, the Superfortress itself kept changing. For night work, commanders stripped most turrets from many aircraft to shed weight and drag. A dedicated variant, the B-29B, kept only a radar-directed tail armament, the AN/APG-15B gun sight system, while replacing blisters with smooth fairings. Lighter airplanes carried more firebombs, flew a little faster, and were harder targets in the dark. Losses fell even as bomb loads rose. But the most quietly devastating twist didn't burn anything. It sank it. In spring 1945, one B-29 wing began dropping sea mines at night. Operation Starvation. Mines went into straits, harbor mouths, and the lanes that fed Japan's cities. Within months, shipping through Kobe, a major port, fell by roughly 85%, from about 320,000 tons in March to $44,000 in July. In just 46 mining missions, YXT-1 Bomber Command laid over 12,000 mines and lost only a handful of aircraft. Yet the barrier they created forced the abandonment of most essential convoy routes and sank or damaged hundreds of ships. Well over 1 million tons of hulls ruined. It was cheap, deadly, and indifferent to searchlights. By early summer, shock turned into exhaustion on the other side of the horizon. The home defense wings were short of fuel, short of trained pilots, and increasingly reluctant to challenge mass raids except when ordered to. Post-war interrogations and survey summaries describe a defense that bled planes and men faster than it could replace them. By June 1945, Japanese leaders were already husbanding aircraft for the final battle they expected on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. In the air, many units simply could not sustain interceptions night after night. Look, for a moment, at the machine from a pilot's eye. In November 1944, a B-29 over Tokyo was a silver dot at 30,000 feet, a thing you could maybe reach once, fire once, and lose in the jet stream. By May 1945, the same bomber might be a dark shape at 6,000, 8,000 feet in rough, smoky air, part of a river of airplanes moving too quickly to queue up for repeated attacks. And now with P-51s dropping in from Iwo to carve up any interceptor that lingered. The bomber's sides were smoother. Its tail gun watched you with radar. If you missed your one clean pass, the fight was over. And if you did not scramble at all, the mines and the flames worked without you. Japan's war economy, already under pressure from submarine warfare, now faced three hammers at once: nightly fires that wrecked industrial districts, mines that strangled ports and inland shipping, and a fighter escort that made cutting into the bomber stream ever more costly. Strategic survey teams that walked those burned streets after the surrender wrote in spare language about factories that no longer mattered because their workers, homes, water mains, and transport had vanished. Endgame came in August. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, Bockscar struck Nagasaki. Those two explosions, the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, and the already ruined condition of the cities and the sea lanes together, broke the last choices open. On September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. The air war, high and low, fire and steel, mine and escort, was over. So what is the final answer to our opening question? Why couldn't Japan's best pilot stop the B-29? It wasn't altitude alone. It was a stack, a bomber with range, endurance, and radar-guided guns, a commander willing to throw out the book and fly lower at night, an island runway placed like a safety net under every mission, and a rapier for long-range escorts, and a mining campaign that starved the empire while the cities burned. Technology mattered, tactics mattered, geography mattered. Together they closed the sky. Before we end, a last image, a B-29 on final approach to Iwo, dawn just lifting, tires smoking against crushed coral. In the radio room, a man who thought he'd die at sea wipes his eyes and laughs. On the other side of the ocean, a factory siren will never blow again. The dock it once fed is quiet water tangled with mines. That's how this campaign finished. Not with one weapon, but with a system that learned, adapted, and did not let go. If you stayed with us through parts 1 to 3, thank you. In our next deep dive, we'll go smaller to go deeper. One crew, one mission, one night, so you can hear this story at human scale. Stay with us.